We're live on Facebook, Las Vegas Triathlon Club, and we're recording. Ted, how's your year going?
Man, my year is started out with a bang. We were just talking about it. Both of us had dog issues last night with fireworks.
Yeah.
Both of us had a rough night. It was interesting. You know, I had a really nice bike ride yesterday to finish off the year. I was very, very happy with my statistics for the year. You know, Strava's got it put it all together, the nice little package. And I was like, oh, like last night I looked at it all. I'm like, yeah, I'm really proud of the year that I had and how many miles I rode and ran and how much I climbed and all these things. And then this morning I woke up and I had a little fit of depression where I was at 0 again. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I've accomplished nothing this year.
Reset. Yeah.
It was a wicked reset on me. And you know, so it was a little bit difficult. I know a lot of people are glad that 2020 is gone, but I literally have I have no training this year.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so for those watching live, they know that this is the first of the year.
Yep.
For those of you watching it recorded, this is our first of the year. So our year is started, and we're looking forward to 2021. But 2020 was actually. There's a lot of good things that I know both you and I and lots of others actually accomplished. And so you're right, the stats were pretty good. And this sort of leads into what we're going to talk about tonight a little bit. I did resist. I had 993 miles running.
And you didn't do a 7-miler yesterday?
I did not do it. I did
not.
I did not. I resisted.
Why?
Well, I had decided to take a big chunk of time off from running.
Yep.
And, these little niggles here and there, and every now and then my calf would flare up. And I do believe it's related to my rheumatoid arthritis, but I did decide, okay, knowing that everything's canceled, who knows when we're going to race again, I think this is an opportunity. I need to take a big chunk of time and back off. So I did resist the temptation to go out, but I did start running today. So, and it felt good.
So it's a new year. John,
it's a new year.
That one day made all the difference in the world.
That's right. The injuries are all, I got a clean slate on injuries now too.
The good news is though, now when you make 1,000 this year, you did more than last year.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Now I'll shoot for 1,000 or more. Wow.
So John, one of the things I wanted to talk about, and that is going to kind of go into the questions we're going to answer tonight, is when you set up a year, or when you think about a year, what do you think about as far as load over a year? Do you purposely set goals for yourself based off of last year's load, or is it just fly by night?
Yep. No, I do. I do have a structure in my mind. I actually will write out a plan, and what I do is I write down my target big day for each week leading up to for an Ironman or even a 70.3. I'll write down a big target, 60-mile ride, 70 mile, whatever it is, 100, what have you. And then I will also have in mind some total mileage weeks that I want to hit, especially for running and biking, and then somewhat for swimming as well. So I do structure that out. But number one goal, stay healthy.
Yeah, don't get injured.
Yeah, stay healthy. That's the key.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of reading and research lately, looking at volume and load, and not just volume and load over a week, a month, but years.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at a 5-year window, how much load should you increase year to year to year to year to stay healthy, right?
Yep.
And what I've come to a conclusion of is it's about a 10% bump you could do per year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's year to year to year to year, right? And if you think about it, if, let's say you did 500 hours this year, which a lot of triathletes would have done, potentially 500 hours. That means the next year you can do 550 hours. And how you spread that out, and that needs to be spread out over the year, right? It can't just be, I'm going to add 50 hours to these 2 months. And there's some good evidence that when we do that, the load management works out well to ultimately not get injured. So, that's something that I've never really done before. I've done it mostly based off of mileage, not necessarily hours, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it'll be something I'm going to try this year is to maybe look at hours spread out over the year. And
Oh, that's good.
yeah,
I was just quickly looking through my log because I have done that where I've lined up each training plan that I followed over consecutive years.
yeah,
So I actually have that in my analog version of my
yeah,
my log, because I do agree with you that it's a multi-year plan. You don't really train for 12 weeks. You don't train for 26 weeks. You train, as a lifestyle, and you try to build over a long period of time.
yeah.
Uh,
And I think that, we've talked about this a little bit before as well. Like at the point of my life right now, I think if I increase volume by 10%, I might only get 2 or 3% faster,
mm-hmm.
better, but I'm
Yeah.
not getting slower,
Yeah.
right? Like as we age, I think that's one of the biggest things is to try to not get slower.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be in the cases. Maybe I stay the same,
Yeah.
right? And I actually would be happy if I could stay the same as I was like last year.
Yeah.
And as I move into into the 50-year-old age group next year, it's like, well, if I could stay the same as I was when I was 45,
Yeah.
I'm winning, right? Like that's a winning formula for me.
No, totally. And that's been my motto, really. I think when I hit my late 40s, that's what I just kept saying, okay, I don't want to get slower. I know that sounds defeatist, but
Yeah.
it's not. It's really, you got to train hard just to keep maintaining a certain speed. And, each year, actually, I did get a little bit faster, but it's still, the mindset is just don't get slower.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the key is like we do know that we're going to deteriorate over time, right? The research is there. Like no matter what you do, you lose muscle, you lose VO2, you're going to lose. And so, we talked about this 3 or 4 weeks ago that one of our goals was to be the oldest person in a race, at one point.
Yep.
And I think you do that by potentially either increasing volume and or potentially increasing maybe some intensity even
Mm-hmm.
as you get older. And it's hard though to keep putting more and more hours in, right? John, what did you have for hours last year?
Oh, you know what? I don't have. I'll have to pull mine up while we're talking, but uh, it was a pretty good year. Although I know I trailed off near the end when finally St. George was canceled.
Right.
That's where I said, okay, now I need to just take a step back and
Right.
hold on. Okay, so where is my? I know you've done this. Where is my end of the year stats?
I think it'll be maybe more on the app where it has that 2020, what's it called? The 2020
2020 recap.
recap. Yeah.
All right. Well, we can keep moving. I'll pull it up. But this is a neat topic to talk about because we're going to do this episode as a Ask Us Anything.
Right.
And boy, we got some good questions.
We got some fabulous questions.
And I think the first round of questions was really built on how to train for an Ironman or an endurance event like that, half or full. Yeah. And so no, that this is sort of neat to sort of lead into that.
Yeah. So I had just over 700 hours of training this year, and so now
That's
for next
great.
year, 770 is probably going to be a good goal for me. And as I start to put together my annual training plan on Training Peaks, which I'm going to do this week, I'm going to try and formulate my plan around about that much time. And I think it's going to be honestly for me, it's going to be tough to get that amount of time in. The COVID world allowed me to train more, and I think a lot of athletes it allowed them to train more. And we talked about it already. Like working from home, I gained not driving to work or whatever, it was easier to hit up a run at lunch, or,
Yep.
it was, yeah, I hate to say it was a good year, but for
Right.
training and for a lot of people, it was a good year.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're still going to be in a situation where we're working remotely. We know that through at least the
Mm-hmm.
summer. So, maybe it'll be easier till then, to put in hours. Um,
Well, I think the mindset is going to be a little easier now.
yes.
Now that we've had this year, unprecedented year of races canceled unexpectedly
Yep.
going into the year. I mean, a year ago, we had no idea
No,
anything,
if you
like
look at last
nothing.
January,
Never
we were
could
all
have even
planning it.
imagined that it
Yeah.
would be something like that.
Yeah. That's
But
true.
now I think now that we've been through it, I think we can approach 2021 with a different attitude where, we can still train and maybe the race is going to get canceled, but at least we have we're doing that with that in mind. So I had 781 hours.
Okay. So we're pretty close.
It's amazing how close our training programs are.
Yeah, it really is. And the funny part is we train so differently.
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, we train pretty similarly in some ways as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's interesting that we're right up at that. So there's for those of you following along at home, John and I average right around in the 700s for hours for a year of training, and that's a hunk, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of time. That's a lot of commitment.
Hmm.
I don't even want to factor it out to how many work weeks that is, but it's like what 30 hours, 40 hours per week for.
That's 15 on average for me.
Yeah, so yeah, it's about 15 hours
Yeah.
per week on
Yeah.
average. And then
Yeah.
of course, we talked about before, like building weeks and
Hmm.
and weeks where we weren't going so hard. So anyways, let's approach this from let's talk about Colleen's questions.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
Colleen,
because I think this is directly related to that. I mean, it's all about, a load and how do you manage it and how do you do it healthy?
yeah. So Colleen is a friend of the show. We're gonna call her a friend of the show. And I know she's one of our listeners that listens pretty much all the time. So I love the fact that we could answer her questions this week. So her questions, and just kind of paraphrasing, she's training, and she was training for her first Ironman. It didn't happen, and so she's going to do another Ironman in this October. And she wanted to know about how many long runs she needed to do and how many long rides she needed to do. And she said, there's kind of a rule of thumb going around that you need to do 3 century rides before your Ironman. And, when I read that question, I was like, yeah, I've heard that too.
I think I've said that.
And the truth of the matter is, like, I agree with it, but I also completely disagree with it.
Yeah, right.
I think it can be relevant and or completely irrelevant depending on who we're talking about
Hmm.
and the load that they've had throughout the year or the years.
Yeah.
Because John, I'm going to tell you, like, for somebody that's training 770 hours a week or a year, doing 300-mile rides is not going to make or break you
Right.
at all, right?
Hmm.
Now, I think it's different if we have an athlete that they're looking to do their first Ironman. I think that there's some benefit to it as long as the load management side is done correctly.
Well, and I'll tell you, I actually I started doing that 3 century ride before an Ironman. I don't know how I started. It just sort of worked out. I did it for Ironman Japan as my first race, and I said, oh, this is pretty good. And the reason why I do 3 before every Ironman, this is all anecdotal, but the first one is like, okay, I got to wrap my mind around doing 100 miles. Obviously it's 112 for a race, but 100 miles is just a nice target number.
Yep.
And that first one is always an intimidating ride. You're 100 miles. I mean, that's a century, and people often work up to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that's so you got to plan it out, nutrition, food, gear, any supplies you need. So that first one's a little intimidating. The second one, you get sort of ease into it, and you get a little bit more confidence, but still you're sort of experimenting, where I am. And then the third one, I'm like, okay, this is no problem. it's 100 miles. Like you said, if you're training, over 700 hours a year, 100 miles is not, yeah, you could do it. And by then, by that third one, now I have the confidence in being able to do the distance, and can even start working in some different intensities, and
Yeah.
thinking down that path. So
Yeah, I think that the 100 mile, and it's interesting. I read quite a bit about this after Colleen put up her question, and there's no evidence, by the way, to
no,
say
there is not.
there isn't. I looked, and but the anecdotal answer is it's probably more psychological than anything,
Hmm.
right? To make that 100, because physiologically there's not much difference between 80 and 100, 90 and 100.
Yeah.
Right? You're doing the same thing,
Mhm.
and you're taxing the system the same. I would contend that in 1 week, if you did two 80s rather than one 100, you'd be
Mhm.
better,
Yeah.
because we would be actually getting more load in that physiologic, in those,
Mhm.
under those physiologic parameters. I know for me personally, when I hit 3 hours at, let's say Ironman pace, or Ironman pace,
Yeah.
I start to feel something different, right? My legs start getting a little tired. I start getting a different type of fatigue that I don't get in any other time, and I like that. Like, when I get to that point, I'm relishing that, and I'm putting time. in that physiologic zone.
Mhm.
And if I can do 4 hours in that zone rather than 2 hours in that zone, in a week, or maybe in a 10-day cycle, I think that might be better.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know. I think there's more than one way to skin a cat in this scenario. I also,
Well, so like, I think that's a great point. And in fact, I think a good model is to try to figure out the least amount of training to get the most effective training response.
yeah,
I think
that's what I'm getting at.
that's important. And now sometimes I do a 100-mile ride just because I enjoy doing a 100-mile ride, and
I'm
it's
the same way.
nice to be out there and riding. But I agree with you that your total load for the week is probably a more important metric than doing one long ride. If that's the only ride you do a week, that's not the right
It's
way to do it.
not going to get it done. Yeah. So if you think about it, like, if the question to the answer is like doing 300-mile rides, well, if your total volume for the week is 100 miles and you do
No,
it in one day,
you're gonna sink.
it's not going to work. So, we spend a lot of time talking about load and load management, and the training scoring stress in that is in Garmin and in Training Peaks. I think is a good way to kind of manage this.
Mhm.
But if you think about it, like when we do interval work, so let's say we're doing interval work for, I don't know, well, let's say to increase our FTP, and I'm doing, let's say 4 times 8, so 4 times 8 minutes. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to accomplish more time at that higher wattage, right? So I'm trying to get 24 minutes at, for most people, like just below or at your FTP.
Right.
It's a lot more manageable to do that when you break it up, when you have
Mhm.
a couple minutes break in between, so you get more load under time. And I think the same approach should be applied to the long run and the long ride. That's my philosophy on that. But you were right. I like a 100-mile ride. I like a
Mhm.
110-mile ride, right? I enjoy, like you do, I enjoy the process of training.
Yeah. No, I very much enjoy it. Now, Colleen asked about research, and you mentioned the research, and for research on Ironman training programs, there's nothing
Yeah.
from a science perspective,
Yeah.
where someone's recruiting people into a study, and then they randomly assign each person or a group of people a particular training program, and then monitor progress. That type of research is so hard to do, and so hard to do well. Training research in general is really hard to do, and sometimes we look at responses from a training study that the the response may not actually be from the stimulus that the researchers are even applying. And so, I can think back to a study where they were looking at bone density, and they were taking people who already, had low bone density and bringing them into exercise. And the exercise was maybe, 1 to 5 minutes. And, came out in a discussion at a conference that, oh, well, and the authors reported that there was a positive bone growth with even a short intensity or intervention. And it was like, they came up, well, how are people getting to your exercise session? Oh, they had to walk up a flight of stairs. They had to, leave a flight of stairs, and they had to, they were sedentary before. And so their whole lifestyle changed just to be part of that training study. And so that's just an example of why this type of work is so hard. And there's so many iterations, as you mentioned, in terms of how to design a training program. But there are some tenets that you can build those programs around. And I know you're really big on this. So go into the load discussion a little bit more about what are the tenets for managing load over a period of time to prep.
Well, if you think about, when we talk about load, there's really only two variables that we can talk about, right? You have duration and you have intensity. That's it. Well, and then I guess we could add mode, right? Is it swimming, biking, or running? But within those modes, we have intensity and we have duration. And if you take intensity and you multiply it by the duration, you can get a number, right? That's basically what the training scoring stress is, or there's so many other ways to look at it. But what we do know, and there's pretty good research on this, in particular around performance and around injury prevention, is that if we increase load too quickly, so we either increase the intensity too quickly and or increase the volume too quickly, we'll get injured, or we'll get to a point where actually our body just can't respond to the stresses applied to it. And we talked about the stress response curves like 2 or 3 months ago. And so really what we have to do is we have to manage the load over time. We just talked about adding 10% per year. Some of the kind of the more the gurus of triathlon are looking at, maybe adding a percent or 2% per week of load. And then we call that a ramp rate in Training Peaks, and in other programs, they call it a ramp rate. So how much we're increasing per week. And it can't be just time, right? We can't say, oh, well, I'm going to do 10 hours this week and I'm going to do 10 and a half hours next week, because the intensity matters,
Yep.
right? So I think that's critical to understand when we're talking about load management. And you have to be very, very careful to not add both intensity and volume too quickly. So in the training programs that I write, I try and keep the load 1 to 2% per week, and then, but in general. But there's a caveat here, is that if we have an athlete, for example, that has been a really high performing athlete, and let's say they took a 2-month break, or they got injured for a couple of months, we can have a higher ramp rate for them because they are habitually basically more robust. Okay. But if we take the average age group athlete and we start to increase them too quickly, we will fail. They will fail. And another big piece to this is understanding how recovery works. And the domain of recovery is also really, really important. So recovery is, we can think of recovery in very short cycles, like a microcycle, like 1 day or 2 days, recovery in a week, recovery in a month. And our body needs to, we have to prioritize recovery in both in a daily sense, in a weekly sense, and a monthly sense to make this all work. And really it turns into just big math and big math equations. If I was to have somebody reach out to me and say, hey, Ted, can you put together a training program for me to, I don't know, let's say compete this summer in an Ironman, and they started out at nothing, it would be really hard to ramp
Yeah.
them up slowly to get there.
Hmm.
But people try and do it all the time,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's where people fail and they get injured. And and don't get me wrong, it's possible you could
Yeah.
get really sneaky and you could do it and you could get lucky.
Well, and sometimes that's your one and done people, and
Yep.
that's the part that I really feel sorry for people, because they put everything in, and then they burn out, I guess would be the word. So I like this explanation. I like to focus on this. So that you've explained here, and maybe I'll take a step back and say load is the total burden
Yeah.
that is applied to the person, and
Or,
that's
or let's call the
everything.
stress. The
That's
stress.
right. That's right. It's
Stress.
everything. It's the dog barking,
Mhm.
during New Year's Eve, not sleeping.
Yeah.
Of course, we should have stayed up to midnight anyhow, but oh well.
Yeah.
And so, but measuring the load is tricky, and there's all different ways to do it. And I love what you said with the big math equation, because this is the holy grail of training, is if you can quantify your load, then you can start to predict your performance. But it's tricky, and because you have some external load issues, your power, your how far you ran, how fast you ran, things like that. But then you have your internal training load and what's happening physiologically or anatomically with bone growth, even neuro or biomechanics and learning. I mean, there's so you have these different, you have external that you can see and measure, and then you have internal, which most of us can't measure, and even subjective, perceived exertion. And I know you're big on trying to get a sense for how people feel in response to training.
Well, we haven't really been touched on like some of the other physiologic markers, like things like overnight heart rate,
Yeah.
overnight respiratory rate,
Hmm.
which the some newer watches can do, and heart rate variability. And
Yeah.
we're going to have a whole show on heart rate variability,
Hmm.
how to use that as well. So those are physiologic markers that are internal that we can look at, and then we will eventually have someone come on the show and talk about blood markers, and you're just taking regular blood and
Hmm.
looking at the blood markers and looking at the stress response, looking at the white blood cell count,
Yeah.
looking at the red blood cell count, and where those are. So yeah, those are all, you're absolutely right. Or even doing like cortisol stress responses.
Yeah.
There's so many ways to look at this. But I still contend that probably the best way is to just talk to the athlete or talk to themselves and like, how do you feel? I think that's pretty, that's pretty important. If you feel horrible, you wake up on a Sunday and you feel horrible because you haven't recovered well, because yes, the dog was barking, or whatever, your smoke alarm went off, because that always happens at 2 a.m, right?
Yeah.
And on your training plan, it says, 5-hour ride at 200 watts. And that's going to be a rough day. You know what you got to do? You got to pivot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is most people don't pivot.
Hmm.
They do it anyways.
Yeah.
And then the stress that was supposed to be a stress score of this, and even on Training Peaks or wherever, it still is that same stress score, because it doesn't recognize how hard it actually was for you.
Hmm.
It gets amplified. And there's some little tricks to look at these things. So when you start to look at, we'll start to talk about power. I think we're gonna maybe next week talk about power. But if you look at your power versus heart rate, right? So there's actually a formula. You can basically just divide power by heart rate and get an efficiency factor, EF. If that's out of whack, like, you leave your house and you're doing 200 watts and your heart rate's 148 and normally it's 138,
Hmm.
guess what? You are overstressed
Yeah.
at that
Right.
point, and it's time to pivot. And knowing how to pivot like that is something that's really, really difficult.
It is, because you struggle with, wait, is this the day I need to push through and
Yeah.
have that mental toughness, or is this the day that I need to back off and rest and recover and get ready for the next training session? So
Yeah. And more often than not, you don't figure it out till you're 3 hours into your 5-hour ride and you're dead.
yeah, right.
Right. And then it's too late because you've
Yep.
already pushed yourself past. And then you're out, I'm at the top of Potosi and I got to get home, right?
Mhm. But that's the,
And
and you're spot on, because that is the, sort of maturity of the athlete, and understanding, yourself to be able to make that decision.
yeah,
So, all right. So now I'm looking at Colleen's question, because this is really sort of got us going. Her question is there any literature that discusses ideal training volume prior to an Ironman? And I'll say, no, there is not specific literature. Well, yes, there is literature discussing it, but no, there's not research on quantifying and identifying the exact volume that you need, partly because your goals are very different for each athlete towing the start line.
well,
But what I
it's
really
also,
like about
it's also history, right?
it's,
So
and it's history, but that's what I was going to say. That's what I like about leading up to this discussion, leading up to reading this question, is because it's not necessarily just total volume. It's that ramping up of volume and ramping up of load that is really important.
yeah, well, and I think the other thing is that where your base is also matters,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if your base is, I don't know, let's say your race is 10 out of 10 fitness,
Yep.
right? But your base, like walking around every day in January, you're a 7, and you're
Yep.
just hanging out at 7, then the ramp is not so drastic,
Right.
right? If you're walking around in January and you're at 4 out of 10, the ramp is more
Mm-hmm.
drastic, and you actually safely may only get to a 7, right? So I think that's why the research is where it is. And there was an interesting research study done, and actually I had a friend that was a participant in it. It was done in England 5 or 6 years ago, and they took was it 20 people that had never done an Ironman, and they
Mm.
were recreational athletes. They were not pro cyclists or anything, and they did a 16-week training program, and
Okay.
they all, to basically get to the start line and finish. I think 12 of them ended up doing it. So you can do it, and the funny thing is I actually talked to the lady that did it a couple of years after, and I asked her, like, do you still do this stuff? No, this was one and done.
Yeah.
And I asked her, like, about the other people that she got to know in this training group, and she's like, yeah, basically all of them were like to do it once.
Yep.
And so you made a really great point about longevity, right? And we're making a big assumption, John, that everyone wants the longevity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for Colleen's answer, if the question is, I want to do one Ironman and then never do this again,
Mm-hmm.
it's a completely different. It's once
Yeah.
again another different answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll go all in. And all right. So now you brought up the base. I did have a sidebar question here
Yeah.
from my wife, Laura. She actually said, okay, well, wait, how do you define base?
Yeah. Now that's because base is not necessarily where you are today either.
Yeah.
I mentioned it earlier. If you've been training consistently for 10 years, or someone like Laura who's been training consistently for even longer than that, your base level is higher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can actually measure by doing different tests. We can kind of measure these things. So we can actually, even if you're not super fit, it's amazing. Your FTP doesn't drop that much.
Mm-hmm.
Your VO2 max doesn't drop very much.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some physiologic markers we can look at to to kind of see where your base is. Yeah. So that's a bigger question.
Yeah.
And we can look back at data on an athlete for 10 years, and they've been consistently training for 10 years. Even if they took 6 months off,
Mm-hmm.
their base fitness is so much greater.
Right.
There's even some research studies on this in sports medicine where they actually looked at tendon girth.
Mm-hmm.
And how much tendon girth, for example, you'd take somebody that was an athlete when they were younger and they were sedentary even for a significant amount of time, their Achilles tendon is still more robust when they're older, right? So they're less likely to, for example, have an Achilles issue,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even though they may have been sedentary for the same amount of time as somebody else, they've built up the connective tissue over time.
Yeah.
And it's the same with their heart, right? Like their heart is going to be more efficient, and their capillarization potentially, or in their blood vessels would potentially be better based off of this long-term training or even past training.
Mm-hmm.
And bone density is another one. Like
Yeah.
research is pretty good on that. If if you have higher bone density at 30, you'll have higher bone density at 40, even if you're sedentary.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. And yeah, and it is funny because, base is a term that we use all the time. We all know what it means, but yet put it in words, it's a little, a little difficult. But I like how you're explaining it. It's your foundational fitness.
Yeah.
And then the trick, though, is to then come up with an operational definition for base. So how do you quantify it? And so you measure. You talked about measuring different physiological markers, and I also, just off the top of my head, said, well, I guess I would operationally define my base as what distance bike ride I'd be comfortable doing.
Yeah, before he starts shaking.
Yeah, right. Before I start saying, "Oh, I better go to bed early" or something.
It's really funny you mentioned that. I was running today along a bike path, and I saw a cyclist laid out on a bench, and I'm like, "Oh, New Year's Day."
Yeah.
Somebody bit off more than they could chew on their New Year's resolution.
Oh, that's funny.
Because you're right. That's probably they wrote they were measuring where their base was. And I find it also, John, I find it really interesting when we define base as well in like the triathlon world, because right now everyone's training base.
Yep.
It's the thing you do in the off season. But base cannot be built in 6 weeks. Base cannot be built in 8 weeks.
That's right.
Base is built year after year after year after year. So I hate, I know Training Peaks uses that, Strava uses it. Everyone uses this term of base, and they go, I'm going to do 8 weeks of base training, and no, it's that you can do 8 weeks of aerobic focus, which is what you maybe should be doing at this point. But the aerobic focus doesn't change too much when you get into your season. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I think that it's such a misnomer when somebody buys a 16-week training plan, and it's like, okay, week 1 through 6 is base.
No, I love it. And I think the way that you and I actually talk about this is we talk about the lifestyle, or enjoying the process, meaning that you're always working on your fitness, and it's just part of your lifestyle, and that's what base is you're fit, that you can go hike Mount Charleston, and it's not going to wipe you out, or you go do some kayaking, that you've got a base foundation of fitness that allows you to do different things. So I love it. All right, I'm going to read Colleen's next question,
let's directly answer her first question about the 300 milers. Let's just give her you agree or I agree, because you go ahead and say yes or no.
I say yes.
Okay. I say no.
I love it.
But based off of what we talked about.
All right. So then now what we'll do is we'll track Colleen's Strava, and we'll see which of us she's going to listen to. So she's going to do.
Because when she trained, and this, maybe we shouldn't be adding this, but when
no pressure, Colleen.
Her first one, she did. I was there when she did her first 100-mile ride. And I got to be honest with you, she looked really good.
Yep.
Right. Yep. And I think it was more of a psychological thing than it was a
totally. Yep. I agree.
I think she was completely ready for it. Yeah. She could have done it probably 3 or 4 weeks earlier and been successful.
No.
And now that she's done it, there's no magic number.
No, that's right.
Right. And I actually would contend that time might be more important than the mileage. Right? Because it's been interesting. People talk about mileage. Oh, I did a 100-mile ride today. Oh, how much altitude did you have? How much time into a headwind did you have?
Right.
Because I've done some 80-mile bike rides that kicked my butt. Yeah. Right. Because of altitude, wind. And so I think distance is not as good. So the one thing I would say as far as advice on somebody getting ready for an Ironman is to look at what you think your bike split is going to be. And there's lots of ways to look at it, and think about the time. Right. So if it's going to be 6 hours and you're going to be in the saddle for 6 hours, you know what, maybe psychologically, maybe you should maybe ride 6 hours,
Yeah.
and don't worry about the distance,
Nope.
right? Because in training, guess what? There's no start line, finish line. Well, maybe your start line, finish line is your house,
Mm-hmm.
but I think maybe the time is more important. So,
Yeah.
okay, let's
No,
go to
I love it.
question two.
Okay. I'm still doing my 3 for every, and it's partly because I got a short memory and I always need to rebuild my confidence for each race. So,
Okay.
all right. So now, I love this question too. I know most people don't run the full 26.2 before a race day, but how close do you need to get and how many times? And I'm also going to tag this one along. What do pros do? I know quite a few have mentioned they run walk with
Yes.
their long runs.
I'm a big fan of the run walk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big fan of it.
Yeah.
So let's tackle the pros first, because I think the answer to the pros. I mean, I've listened to thousands of podcasts of the pro triathletes, and it completely varies.
Mm-hmm.
There are some pro triathletes, and there's evidence that they've said that they were injured for like 8 weeks, didn't run before their Ironman, just did a lot of pool running, which we've talked about, hiking, whatever the case, and then they go and then they can do it.
Yeah.
So, and then there's some that are putting in 70, 80 miles a week,
Mm-hmm.
right? I would say anecdotally, what I understand with pros is somewhere between 50 and 70 miles per week.
Mm-hmm.
Is a reasonable number for a pro.
For a pro, that's right.
Right, but remember,
this is what they do. This is their
what they do.
day-to-day life is to train for races. It's not someone who has a full-time job.
Yeah. And then, I did some reading on the Training Peaks website, and they produced some data that when we look at age groupers and successful age groupers, it's somewhere between 30 and 50 miles per week. Yeah. And I think it's more important, once again, to quantify miles per week, miles per month, than it is the long run distance. Right. And when you look at the research on injury and physiology and how it relates to longer runs, I don't know what you came up with, John, but there's not much difference between a 2:30 run, 2 hours and 30-minute run, and a 3-hour run. Right. As far as the benefit. But the injury rate gets significantly greater as you tack on those more more miles. So anecdotally, I think with top level age groupers, most of them probably max out at about 20-mile run.
Yeah. So let me jump in on the injury part, because I think that's the underlining question. It's not, if you can run 26.2 miles, more power to you. The problem is you're running the risk of an overuse injury. And that is the biggest problem with running, is that you're more likely to get an overuse injury during running than either cycling or swimming. And the research is out there on quantifying injuries to triathletes. I always like to use numbers like this for running, training for a marathon, that if you take 100 people, they train for a marathon, 75 of them are going to get some type of injury during that training program. And 25 of them are going to have to stop running for some period of time because of the injury. That is the injury rate with training for a marathon. For an Ironman, they've done a lot of work. There is some good research out there on retrospective studies on injury rates for triathletes, and some prospective studies, which is great. The challenge with this research is often defining what is an injury. And it does actually differentiate between studies, in that some studies will be, an injury is you have to miss a training day, or 2 training days. Whereas some research is more in line with, it's influencing the way that you're going to approach. So not necessarily something that's making you stop training. So that's a little bit more broad and loosely defined. And so that's one of the problems in research, is that we are not in agreement with what injury is. So when you read your injury stats, or if you see something that's published, just know that a lot of the problem is how you define what an injury is. But that being said, interestingly, the injury rates are actually quite high for training for an Ironman or an endurance event. So if you take that same 100 people I mentioned before and you track them, you may get as many as 80, maybe even 90 will get some type of injury. Now, how many of those will take time off? I don't have those numbers. That's a little different. But the injuries that they do sustain, 50% of them will be running and then cycling. And then maybe, less than 10% of the injuries will be in the swimming arena. So,
I hate that you said that because I'm not swimming right now because I have an injured shoulder.
well, I was going to actually say something like that is because part of the reason probably is that you're spending less time swimming to begin with. So
My shoulder issues, when I crashed pretty bad last year, and I just cannot seem to get over that. My collarbone was separated, and it's still not back to normal, and it still clicks and pops, and I know what's wrong with it, but I can't seem to get over it. So I'm working. I'm doing my rehab stuff all the time. But it's funny you mentioned that. Well, let's talk about then, John, and just really briefly, why other than load, we talk about the biomechanics of injury and pathomechanics of injury of running, and why the run walk works so well. I don't know. Do you want to address it, or do you want me to address it?
Well, I'll start, and then I think you're going to have a broader perspective. For a long time we consider that impact between that collision between the foot and the ground as being the causative reason for an injury or overuse injury, and that's why you have different shoes. That's why maybe you run on different terrain. And running has a bigger collision than walking. So from a impact management, walking just is easier on the body. The problem is you don't go as fast.
So I'm going to add, I think that you're right as far as that's concerned, but I also think that the mechanics of running change as well. So as we become fatigued in the muscles, in particular the muscles that stabilize us, our gait changes drastically. I mean, we can look at videos of people finishing Ironmans, right? And they're doing the Ironman shuffle, and they're having significant hip drop, and their pelvises are all unstable. But you look at them in mile 1, 2, 3, they have stability. And it's the change of gait, I believe, that as we get fatigued in running, that is going to create a lot of these a lot of the injuries we're talking about, because a lot of them really do have to do with stabilization. And when we walk, we allow the stabilizer muscles, and we allow basically time to rest and recover, and so then our technique stays better longer. And I was looking for a research study on this. I didn't find one. I bet there's one out there that looks at the biomechanics of running after, for example, you do a 2-hour run, then you start to go run walk versus, to get to 3 hours versus a 3-hour run, and what the mechanics look like.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great study.
Yeah.
There's actually quite a bit of work in looking at mechanics at the beginning and ending of different events. But yeah, that's actually a study we could do that. That would be a good one.
I think that answers the question, right? Of like, why run walk works so well. So when I prescribe run walk for people, I do it in an aerobic phase as well to help with maximum aerobic function and pushing the LT or lactic threshold 1 up. But I also do it later when we're starting to extend people's time for that very reason. And I would the second half of the run turns into a run walk. Or I'm also a big fan of doing a run followed by a hike.
Yeah. Hiking is really seems to be the latest.
Yeah. Especially
provide load safely.
Especially when you're already fatigued. What I'd love to do is get a situation where we could do it where we did the run, then we did the hike up the hill, and then you could take a chairlift down. So we have that big eccentric load where we came back down the hill. Right. So maybe we'll have to do that at Mount Charleston one time.
Yeah.
But I do think that's Colleen, if I was advising you as you get up into those 20-mile runs, really consider the run walk.
Yeah.
And there's different ways to do it. I'm a big fan of, run 4 minutes, walk 1 minute. And that 1 minute seems to be enough to kind of reset you. Yeah. The other thing, and John, I wanted to add into here, and she didn't ask it, but I also think that there's a little bit of a confusion, and we will get into this in the new year as well. And I just want you to start to think about this, and have everyone start to think about it is how much speed work do we need to do for somebody that's training for an Ironman?
Yeah.
Right. And because if we look at like finishing times, right, and we look at the average finishing time for the run portion of an Ironman for an age groupers, do you know the number?
No.
It's like between, depending on the course, like 4.5 hours is kind of the average.
Okay.
So what's that pace? Right? Is that like a 12-minute mile?
Yeah, that'd be right around 11, 12-minute mile. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So why are we prescribing people to do 7-minute mile repeat?
I say that all the time. That's I love it. Yeah.
And it's such a hard thing to get through people's brain that you are going to be running 11-minute miles. If you're really good, you're going to be running maybe 8 or 9-minute miles. And if you're that good, why are you doing your repeats at 6-minute miles?
Yep.
Right? Because Ironman is not a speed game. It's a don't slow down game.
Yeah. So let me jump in, because this is so good, and it actually relates. Matt just asked a question that's right related to this. He says, what would be the impact difference between someone that walks versus cutting your pace substantially? What's really important to know is that when you run at different paces, you run differently.
Yeah.
So if you run a 7-minute mile, I know that seems obvious, but it is important to recognize you are running differently than if you run a 10-minute mile or a 12-minute mile.
And you're loading completely different.
And that's exactly right, is that your impact will be different. The number of impacts that you get will be different. And the stress that you place on different structures in your body will be different for each different pace. And so that is why it's so important that if you are going to be running 12-minute miles, you got to practice running 12-minute miles, because that's how your technique will adapt to that stress.
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely critical. And you can test this for those of you that are listening here, and that you run, let's say you run a 9-minute mile just for your training pace. And then you have a friend that says, hey, I'd like to go for a run with you. And they run on a 10:30.
Yeah.
It is hard. It's physiologically very difficult for you to run slower.
Well, I always tell the story of Greta Weltz, who was a great New York City marathoner. She won, 2:15 type of marathoner. Fred Lebau was the originator of the New York City Marathon and president of the New York City Roadrunner Club.
Yeah.
And he got cancer, and he decided to run the marathon, do the marathon one year as he was fighting cancer. And so she decided to do it with him. And after finishing, I don't remember what the time was, but they asked her how was that easy? And she said, no, that was one of the hardest ones I did, because she would have been doing probably a 5-hour marathon when she's usually done in 2:15. And so her movement patterns, her tissues were not prepared to be able to do a 5-hour marathon. You just run differently, you move differently. And so you got to practice the pace that you need to train at. And if you are going to use a run walk, which I agree, I think there's a lot of advantage to that, you got to practice that too, because a lot of the advice is, and even the pros will do this, is their walk aid stations and then run. Well, if you're not practicing that, you're not maximizing your preparation for a race.
In Arizona, the Ironman I did, that actually kind of got me, because I really didn't practice run walk.
Yeah.
And at mile 16, I decided to walk an aid station, and it was the first one I walked, and I cramped.
Yeah.
Right. I still think if I would have just kept running, even if it's slow, I'd have been better, because I wasn't used to that quick change of pace. And I couldn't agree with you more on that, John. I think that's really, really important. And I also think it's we'll talk more about intervals and long distance intervals, but working with somebody and that really does get it and understands how to use those intervals, especially if your goal is an Ironman, because there are times when intervals are important. Don't get me wrong, because we can build physiologic systems by doing those intervals, but that is the art right now of training. And once again, there's not a ton of research on this, right? Because think about how hard it would be to do a research study where you had somebody swim 2.4 miles, bike 116, and now let's do some run analysis on you based off of if you did high intensity intervals versus medium intensity intervals on your training.
No.
It's just so difficult.
Well, and to add to that complexity, I mean, there's the research trying to understand the multi-sport training principles, because the key is there interference or is the training additive? That is, that if I, does my swimming help my running? Does my running help my biking? Or does my running interfere with my cycling, or vice versa? And I think that's like you talk about right now, it's the art, because it's a tough question to answer, because there's so many different ways to approach training, that some are additive and some are maybe interfering.
I think that this takes us down another rabbit hole, and once again we can talk about this down the road, is looking at what makes for a successful run leg. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that comes up time and time again is what you did on the bike. Mm-hmm. Like, did you overbike? Did you underbike? How prepared were you? How was your bike fitness? How much variability did you have during your bike? All of those things play a role, and we will talk about that. And then I'll throw it back onto Colleen's question of like, how many long runs should you do? Mm-hmm. Well, how many long runs should you do after you bike?
Yeah, that's right.
Because running fresh, mm-hmm. or maybe even a little fatigued from the week's worth of training, is different than running after you've biked a significant amount of time.
No, and that's a good point. And I think that's where triathlon training, you got to dial that in. And I've actually worked more towards having longer runs after a long bike ride. Makes for a long day, yeah. But I think that's an important part of our
But I'd contend that you'd be better off adding to your run like that and doing maybe an hour less on the bike. Mm-hmm. If the time is the constraint, yeah. Right? Do a 4-hour bike instead of a 5, and then and an hour run might ultimately be better. But once again, that's the art. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of variability there. So, well, I think, John, we did a pretty good job of answering Colleen's questions, and I'd like to thank her for asking those questions, because those were really good, and it caused both John and I to really think and to go in and do some reading, and and maybe give us a great research idea.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
No, that's great. And so maybe we need to give some quick take-home points. So the key with being successful in Ironman is stay healthy. Yep. And load management.
Yeah, manage your load appropriately. Yes, do not increase your volume times intensity too quickly.
Yeah, and then that's where whether or not you do 3 centuries or what your long runs are, it's all about load management.
And I'll tell you, I'll come back around with 3 centuries, but I'd say do 1 a month for the 3 months before.
There you go. Yeah.
So now you're bringing it out over time.
Yeah. Hey, Ted, this has been great.
Yeah, that was awesome. And once again, thank you for the questions. And we've got a lot of questions on coming through. So we talked about this. January is going to be answering a bunch of questions, which is great, and we'll continue to do it.
Oh, and we've got this nice bank. In fact, I'm going to copy and save all these, and these will come back in other episodes. So this 2021, our first one on the first day of 2021.
Yep.
We're off to a good
start. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
Okay.
All right. See you, Ted.
Bye.